In this lesson, we'll learn a few different ways of quickly getting data from our scene into our ice tree. So here's where we left off, and you can open up 10 particles interact end. So right now we have our particles interacting with our first beaker. However, as soon as it hits the tube, of course it does not interact with it yet because we don't have it in our ice tree. So let's select our point cloud and let's jump back into our ice tree by just hitting Alt 9. And let's now take a look at our bounce off surface node, which is right here. So we used a get data node to get our beaker 1, but that required a little bit of work. So let's see how we can get this a little bit faster. So one method is we can use the Explorer. So we can jump to our scene here, and let's say we need to grab the tube. So we just left click and drag the tube from our Explorer into our ice tree. And now you can see we have a get data node that is already set to tube, and we have our surface. Now of course you can also do this using the 8 key to bring up your Explorer, and again simply left clicking and dragging that in. So to connect this up, remember that if the port is empty or is hollow, that means you can connect something into it of the same color and it will create a new port to accept it. So let's plug our get tube into the new surface 1, and now let's play back our simulation. Now you can see the particles are hitting our tube and bouncing around, but we of course still need to get the last beaker in. And we have a few problems with the particles flying away. So the last way, or the last method I prefer of getting objects into our scene is just doing a quick selection, hitting F3, and then just left clicking and dragging. So remember that you can left click and drag from any of our Explorer lists into your ice tree to bring in objects that exist in our scene. So let's connect up our last beaker here and let's take a look at the simulation, because there's a few things we're probably going to need to change. So right now the particles are bouncing around very excitedly, and as you can see some of these particles are escaping. So this is happening for a few different reasons. The first is that our bounce off surface is keeping all of the energy of the particles. So what that means is every time a particle bounces off the surface, it does not lose any momentum. Now this is of course unrealistic and can cause problems with intersection and particles moving around too quickly. So let's grab our bounce off surface, and what we can do is turn down this bounce factor. So let's bring it down to something like 0.9 or 0.95. And now if we play this back, we can see that the particle simulation is very close to the previous one. However, the particles are getting a little bit slower as they move along this interaction. So the more bounces it has, the more energy is lost. However, we're still losing particles into our scene. So let's take a look at another attribute we can change inside of our bounce off surface node. The next one we can use is offset distance. So we can see here it's currently set at 0, which means that these particles are hitting the exact polygon faces of our surface here and then bouncing off. However, what we can do inside this bounce off surface node is say use a little bit of an offset. So push it in just a little bit so that the particles don't have to directly interact with the surface. And so what we can do is we can just increase this just a little bit to something like 0.5 and play this back. And now you'll see the particles are bouncing off the inside of our beaker. Instead of going exactly up to the wall, they're now bouncing off almost a small offset inside. As you can see, that has mostly alleviated or removed our problem of particles bouncing out of our surfaces. So remember that if you're using a bounce off surface node and you need to remove or particles are leaving the model, you can change or decrease the bounce factor and use an offset distance to help keep the particles inside of your objects. So now that we have our simulation essentially working in a rough state, let's now come in the next lesson and take a look at how we can render these particles. Now of course this is working. I just want to remind that we have disconnected our gravity force. If we plug this back in, of course, we won't be able to see the interaction because our particles are just pulled right back down. So later on, we're going to have to figure out how to get around this because, again, without the gravity force, they sort of just fly out everywhere. So let's now get to rendering these particles.